Welcome to today's critique, where we are analyzing a submission called The Rhode Island Commentary, which argues the recent Robert Doran hockey game shooting stems from untreated mental illness and societal delusion affirmation rather than just gun act.
Right. And our goal today is to break down the argumentation, the structural flow, and the rhetorical consistency to maximize this piece's persuasive impact.
The opening segment establishes a position of neutrality that is immediately contradicted by the subsequent rhetorical.
Yeah, this is the first thing that jumped out at me right at the top. The introduction criticizes both the left and the right for immediately politicizing the tragedy.
Which is a great hook.
It is. It lowers defenses. But then almost immediately the script pivots to a highly specific partisan viewpoint.
Exactly. You hear terms like gender confused, mocking the they-them pronouns, and blaming a society that affirms delusions.
And the weakness here is that it creates this massive bait and switch.
Right.
The listener expects a nuanced, non-political deep dive, but what they actually receive is a standard partisan critique.
Which is incredibly dangerous for audience retention because you risk alienating the movable middle.
Precisely. Those are the listeners who might actually agree with the mental health angle. They are open to that conversation, but they get turned off by the immediate ideological signaling.
They feel tricked.
Yeah. So the suggestion here is to align that opening promise with the actual delivery.
Don't pretend you don't have a side when you clearly do.
Right. Instead of claiming to be tired of political finger-pointing, frame that fatigue around superficial finger-pointing.
Like just yelling racism or guns and leaving it there.
Exactly. That allows you to introduce your specific mental health or delusion argument as a much deeper analysis rather than a completely non-political one.
Let's look at a concrete example of how to actually fix this in the script. Currently, the phrasing is something like, I am just tired of the finger pointing because obviously this issue is so much deeper than politics.
And then a few seconds later it says, choose the latter, just saying, and goes into the partisan talking points.
Yeah, it's jarring. So a suggested revision could be something like, while the left screams racism and the right screams groomers, both sides miss the uncomfortable reality staring us in the face. A profound mental health collapse that goes beyond simple political talking points.
That is so much better. It acknowledges the bias but frames it as looking at the uncomfortable truth.
Or as an alternative approach, just acknowledge the bias right up front. You could literally just say, everyone has a political take, including me. But I want to look at the evidence the mainstream narrative is completely ignoring regarding the shooter's psychiatric history.
I love that. It builds trust instantly.
Right.
Okay, so moving into the actual mechanics of the piece, the core argument relies on a correlation between the shooter's transition and their violence. But the causal chain requires much stronger evidentiary glue to be persuasive.
This is the engine of the whole commentary. And the weakness analysis here is that while the script effectively lists facts, the divorce, the gender reassignment in the court docs, the daughter's testimony about his mental health issues,
it completely conflates gender identity issues directly with violent mass murder without bridging the gap.
Right. It just jumps from A to Z.
It uses the phrase affirming somebody's delusions as the primary explanation for the violence. But the script never explains how that affirmation actually leads to shooting a family at a hockey game.
It's just presented as a given.
Yeah, and the thing is, they actually have the missing link in the script.
Yes.
The senior day exclusion theory.
Yes.
But it appears way too late.
Exactly. It's buried so far down that it can't support the main thesis effectively when the audience actually needs it. So the suggestion here is to strengthen the toxic empathy argument by explicitly connecting that lack of intervention to the escalation of the violence.
Focus less on the identity itself and much more on the failure of the system to intervene because of that identity.
Use that senior day anecdote much earlier to show the actual collision between the shooter's internal reality and the external reality.
Let's workshop the flow, because right now it discusses the transition, then the divorce, then it takes a weird jump to a critique of blue sky censorship.
Which is a massive detour.
Huge detour. And then eventually wanders back to the senior day theory near the end.
So a concrete structural change. Move the senior day exclusion up and present it as the catalyst.
How would you phrase that?
You could say something like, here is a man whose internal reality, being Roberta, clashed with the external reality of his family's rejection at senior day. When society tells you your internal reality is the only truth, you lose the ability to cope when the world disagrees.
See, that bridges the gap. You're explaining the mechanism of the violence.
Right. Instead of just saying affirmation caused this, You refine the argument. You argue by treating his identity crisis as a civil rights triumph rather than a psychiatric red flag. The people around him were disarmed, literally and figuratively, from addressing his volatility.
That phrasing is fantastic because it takes the blame off the abstract concept of identity and places it on the actionable failure of the community and the medical system.
Exactly. Which actually brings us to a fascinating wrinkle in the source material. The script introduces fascinating contradictory evidence about the shooter's politics, but misses an opportunity to leverage this complexity for the main argument.
Yeah, the conservative trans twist.
Right. The script reveals that the shooter was a Trump supporter, liked Nick Fuentes, and hated, quote, commie assholes.
Which is wild. But the weakness is how the host handles it. They just dismiss it as horseshoe theory or just call it weird.
Which totally undermines their own premise.
It does. It weakens the whole leftist indoctrination angle they were hinting at earlier. It leaves this massive loose thread. I mean, if the shooter was right-wing, how exactly is left-wing affirmation to blame for his radicalization?
It's a glaring plot hole in the argument. So the suggestion is to use those political contradictions to double down on the mental instability.
Don't run away from the contradiction. Lean into it.
Argue that a stable person simply does not hold these contradictory views. You cannot be a trans woman and a Nick Fuentes fan if your brain is working correct.
Exactly. Frame the political incoherence as a symptom of the mental illness. It proves that looking for a traditional political motive is completely futile.
Let's look at the concrete phrasing. Currently, the script says, I suppose the day was bound to come. It's the horseshoe political theory at work.
It sounds like an apology, like they're embarrassed by the facts.
Yeah. So a suggested pivot would be the fact that he was a trans woman who loved Nick Fuentes isn't just a political oddity. It is proof of a fractured psyche.
Yes.
It demonstrates that he was latching on to any extreme identity, whether gender or political, to fill a void. Affirming one delusion likely empowered him to dive deeper into others.
That is such a powerful flip. You are taking the exact piece of evidence that ruins your political argument and using it to make your psychological argument bulletproof.
And as an actionable addition, you could contrast the shooter's online persona, show how he was threatening Alex Jones on one platform while supporting Trump on another.
Show the volatility. It reinforces that instability is the core issue, not ideology.
Okay, we need to talk about the ad. The placement of the commercial break disrupts the narrative tension and undermines the gravity of the subject matter.
Yeah, this was a really rough moment in the script. The weakness analysis here is all about pacing and tone.
The script is building all the significant tension, discussing the finger-pointing and the dark complexity of the shooter.
And then jarringly pivots to a Givetti ad about postpartum nutrients and Grand Canyon University scholarships.
It's brutal. This abrupt tonal shift from a mass murder analysis to functional medicine, it really risks making the host appear commercially opportunistic rather than seriously concerned.
It gives you whiplash. And the transition phrase they use before we dive into the rest of the story is such a cliche that it actually highlights the interruption.
It hangs a lantern on it. So the suggestion is pretty straightforward. Group the advertisements either earlier as a pre-roll or put them after a distinct chapter of the story has concluded, rather than right in the middle of the setup.
If a mid-roll is absolutely contractually necessary, you have to create a stronger thematic bridge or just do a hard break, rather than trying to slide it in casually.
Because you cannot slide casually from family annihilation to postpartum vitamins.
No, you just can't.
So for a concrete example, right now the transition is, this issue is so much deeper than politics. Now, before we dive into the rest of the story, I do want to take a moment to tell you about my friends over at Givetti.
Awful.
Yeah, suggested placement, move that ad to after the section discussing the New York Times headline and the initial facts. Let the audience digest the baseline information first.
And use a better bridge. Something like, we are going to look at the media cover-up next. But first, a quick word from our sponsors who keep this independent analysis possible.
Acknowledging the break is always better than feigning a smooth transition when the topics are this mismatched.
And honestly, if the ad has to stay there, change the copy tone. Avoid the personal anecdotes about postpartum recovery immediately following a story about a shooting. Just do a flat, neutral read for the sponsor.
Respect the gravity of the room you just built.
Exactly.
All right, let's look at the ending. The conclusion correctly identifies the failure of the mental health system, but dilutes the impact by relitigating online censorship.
The classic problem of missing the forest for the trees at the finish line.
The script actually has a strong point in there, affirming that illness only makes it worse. But then the weakness is that the final segments spend a huge amount of time on Reddit comments and whether Blue Sky is censoring posts.
Which, while maybe relevant to a broader culture war, feels incredibly small compared to the institutionalization solution that was proposed earlier in the critique.
Right. The ending feels like a critique of internet discourse rather than a solution for preventing violence.
It shrinks the scale of the tragedy down to a moderation complaint. So the suggestion is to completely center the conclusion on the institutionalization argument.
Yes, the Greg Price quote, where he says, sent to an asylum instead of having his delusions affirmed, that is the strongest, most provocative part of the entire argument.
It should absolutely be the anchor of the finale.
Let's give them a concrete example of how to stick the landing. Currently, the ending is discussing Reddit commenters who coddled the unstable individual, and it vaguely mentions a public health crisis.
It trails off.
So here is a suggested closer. Robert Doran signaled his break from reality in 2020. The system affirmed. He signaled violence on Twitter. The system ignored him. The solution isn't better moderation on Blue Sky. The solution is having the courage to say, you are sick and you need an institution, not a hormone prescription.
Boom! That is a closer. It summarizes the failure, dismisses the trivial internet stuff, and leaves the audience with a concrete, provocative stance.
And from an actionable editing standpoint, just cut the lengthy reading of the Reddit thread.
Or summarize it in one sentence to save time. Just say Reddit demanded tolerance and move on to your solution-oriented conclusion.
Don't give anonymous internet commenters the final word of your script.
Never.
All right, let's recap the main actionable advice for the author. Number 1, align the opening neutrality pledged with the actual political tone, or just drop the pretense entirely.
Number 2, bridge the logical gap between identity affirmation and violence by using the senior day exclusion as the concrete catalyst.
Number 3, leverage the shooter's political contradictions to prove mental instability rather than awkwardly dismissing them.
Number 4, fix your ad placement. Respect the gravity of the topic with a hard break.
And finally, focus the conclusion on the institutionalization argument. Leave the audience with a powerful takeaway, not a complaint about social media algorithms.
The bones of this piece are incredibly strong. If they implement these structural tweaks, it's going to be a powerhouse commentary.
We would love to see how it turns out. We invite the listener to submit the revised script back to us for a follow-up critique, specifically looking through the tone and style lens once these structural foundations are locked in.
Looking forward to it?
Thanks for joining us for today's critique. Keep writing, keep refining, and we will see you next time.